Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Spencer here and myself, Brad. And today we're talking about preventing data breaches. Specifically, we're talking about strategies to mitigate initial compromise.
Yeah. So this was another brainchild of mine, kind of inspired from the threat reports that come out around this time of the year, which is like the Mandiant M-Trends report, the Verizon DBIR, CrowdStrike's 2025 Global Threat Report, Unit 42's reports. So there's a lot of good reports that come out around this time of the year. And what I wanted to talk about is kind of the three or four primary factors that lead to initial access or initial compromise for most organizations. And what that means, what that looks like. We'll dissect some common attacks. And I really wanted to talk about defensive mitigations, strategies, and kind of what all of this means. And if you're listening, if you're an IT manager, a CISO, a sysadmin, or anybody else in security who kind of has to tackle this kind of stuff and defend against this kind of stuff, share some actionable advice or guidance on how to best protect against this stuff.
Yeah, this is one of the things that we have a lot of pretty extensive conversations with clients about, right? Especially given, your specialty on initial access and internal pen testing. And so I feel like we talk about this more than other subjects because, this is kind of, I guess the front line would be the easiest way to describe it, right?
Yeah, and it's something that, from a offering perspective, there's a number of offensive security services that you can do to emulate this kind of thing.
Mhm.
And my kind of specialty kind of takes, or takes the initial access and runs with it, right? Like I come in after the fact, right?
Yeah.
And kind of explore what happens after the fact as kind of my happy place. But this gets a lot of coverage because there's a lot of discussion related to detection, right? We want to detect, we want to be resilient. But I think it's also to talk about prevention too. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, whatever that saying, or an ounce of
Prevention is worth a pound of cure. Yep.
There you go. So I think the same kind of thing for cybersecurity, right? Like we should also think about prevention. How can we actually start to prevent some of this stuff? And that's what we're going to talk about. So a couple stats to kind of start out, because I think it's really important to kind of lay the groundwork here. But the 2025 Mandiant M-Trends report, we did an episode on that. So go check that out. But exploitation or exploits continue to be the most common initial infection vector. They found 33% related to exploitation. And again, in that report, first time that stolen credentials rose to the second most common in 2024. It's 16%. Specifically, when you're looking at the cloud, initial infection vectors were 39% email, phishing, and 35% stolen credentials. In the CrowdStrike 2025 Global Threat Report, the fastest recorded e-crime breakout was 51 seconds and an average of 48 minutes. And then I'm going to share a couple others here, and I just kind of want to just throw these out here, canon, style. But Unit 42
before you jump into that, though, I want to back up just a little bit, and because I think there might be some listeners that may not understand like what exploits mean, right?
Yep.
And so I think that is kind of an ambiguous term that's kind of thrown around a lot. So like let's dive into that just a little bit before we get into those, because what are we talking about when we say like exploits continue to be the most common initial infection vector?
Yeah, we're talking about stuff like MoveIt, stuff like the Fortinet devices, the Avanti Secure Connect stuff. There was another big one that I'm misremembering, but those kinds of things. So web applications, web infrastructure, edge devices are kind of like the big ones. And we're talking about exploitation of those things. So 0 days or end days or vulnerabilities that have just been released, that there is proof of concept code or not, but threat actors are targeting those and exploiting the vulnerabilities in those to get access to organizations, right? To get initial access to those organizations.
Dude, like I just have a hard time getting my head around that a little bit, right? Because in 2025, we are still not wrapping layered security around edge devices. You know what I mean? Like the
Mhm.
idea of just dropping an appliance on the public internet
Yep.
absolutely blows my mind, dude.
Yep.
And so there are so many ways to not do that it's pretty wild to me.
Yep. And foreshadowing, two of the things I want to talk about are WAFs and DMZs, right? Like two are the things that
Nice.
I think have a meaningful chance at mitigating some of this or preventing some of it. Like
Mhm.
we're kind of, the theme of this episode. So Unit 42 so this was from 2021, I believe. So a little bit older report,
Mhm.
but the median time from compromise to data exfiltration fell to 2 days, and with 45% of cases seeing data stolen with 24 hours, right?
Dang.
So just to kind of like summarize a couple of those stats, right? Exploitations are increasing, credential compromise is increasing, and time to exfil is also decreasing. So some key
So
things
all
there.
bad news.
Yeah, yeah. And so the last stat I want to cover is from the DBIR, which was just released. And that speaks to a couple things. One is third party involvement in some sort of data breach was 30%, which was up from 15% last year. So significant, the increase doubled, right, from third party involvement.
So what is third party involvement exactly? What does that mean?
Yeah, third party involvement is like stuff like Snowflake, or third party gets compromised or they have some vulnerability in their product, and that leads to access to an organization
Okay, so
or
like
initial access
SolarWinds,
or
for example.
credentials or something like that affects another organization.
Okay, got it, got it, got it. So basically, these are things that are more or less outside of your sphere of control,
Yeah.
but still have a radical amount of impact on you. Yeah,
Yep. They could be also like hosting providers,
yeah.
right? Where you host your WordPress site, those kinds of things as well.
Wow.
Last couple stats before we get into like the nuts and bolts of this are 60% of breaches involve the human element, and that was no change from last year. But what was interesting is that there has been a greater involvement of exploitation of vulnerabilities for initial access, cited by the Verizon DBIR. So multiple outfits, the DBIR and the MTrends report, both reporting increases in exploitation of vulnerabilities. And that was kind of the story of 2024 and kind of still going into this year is credential compromise, and social engineering kind of tied together, exploitation of vulnerabilities, and third parties. Those are like the 3-4 big things that I think most organizations should be concerned about or care about and kind of design defenses around when we talk about layered defense and security, those kinds of things. Those are the big four, in my opinion.
So I want to pause and side trip for just a minute, right? So we're in the middle of working with a fairly large organization on a pen test. You know who I'm talking about? Probably they're the ones that we're still working with, and so one of the things that we've been debating with them about is they have this really strong opinion that, well, we have VPNs and we have MFA, and a lot of the vulnerabilities of their systems lie outside of their internal network. And so those are kind of the three answers that we've gotten back when we did this really in-depth penetration test, internal, external. Like we really looked at everything, and they're like, oh, those systems aren't in our environment, or those vulnerabilities are behind authentication with users that have been vetted with background checks. And what I'm taking away from this, and this is kind of what we were trying to explain to them, is none of that matters, dude. Like those are not mitigating factors for the topics at hand. And this illustrates that beautifully, because all of these are things that exist to defeat those specific
Mhm.
defensive mechanisms, if you can even really call it that, right?
Yep.
And so that's pretty wild, though, that
Yep.
that all of this initial access has kind of pivoted outside of those standard controls. But it makes sense, right? The cat and mouse game between the
Yep.
good guys and the bad guys. So anyway,
Yep.
I just thought that was an interesting observation, because the timing of this is impeccable with regards to that
Yeah.
conversation.
Absolutely. And I wanted to pick your brain really on one of the first kind of defensive mitigations or defensive controls, and that's WAFs, web application firewalls. That's, when we look at the most common initial infection vectors, especially when it relates to exploitation and exploitation of web infrastructure or web applications, SaaS products, things like that. I think WAFs are a good option for that, and something that we don't see nearly enough on our external and web app pen tests and API pen tests that we do, but it can be very powerful at blocking known exploits, at patching vulnerabilities that can't be patched by the software vendor, right? Like you can patch things or put mitigations in place that maybe can't be implemented by the vendor itself. And of course, there's anomaly detection, logging, and stuff like that. But I wanted to get your perspective on WAFs in general and how we can, use those and implement those into our defensive strategy, and what type of stuff that those are kind of good at blocking in relation to this conversation.
Yeah, man. So I'm a huge fan of web application firewalls. I didn't used to be because they weren't always the best thing going, right?
Mm-hmm.
That in the early years, like maybe in 2006, 2007, they were mostly appliances. They generally tended to bottleneck you a little bit. We don't live there anymore, man. We have cloud-based WAFs that are absolutely outstanding. And for those of you who aren't familiar with some of the challenges associated with web applications, and really, I'm just going to say layer 7,
Mm-hmm.
because the application firewalls are really not WAFs anymore. They are literally application proxies or reverse proxies,
Mm-hmm.
and so you can protect things more than just an old .NET C# app, right? And so the level of protection that you can wrap around some of these applications is insane. You can front end CAPTCHAs. You can force authentication, pre-authentication before you're even allowed to get there. And you actually hit on some really good ones, right? Is they block some of the more well understood attacks like SQL injection and cross-site scripting and CSRF attacks. So they're just a ton of capability. Here's the challenge, right? The challenge with a web application is it takes a tremendous amount of time and resources to make it right. And if you don't make it right the first time, now you have this, public facing web application, which will just stick with the web app for now. And it might not have all the features that you want, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't just flip a switch. It's not like applying a patch from Microsoft. You got to pay some dude or group of dudes to write a solution to this problem. And in the meantime, the application's vulnerable the whole time you're working on fixing the issue. And due to the nature of these apps, they have to be on the internet, right? And a lot of people don't know this or don't understand it in this context, but the protocols, HTTP and HTTPS, were originally designed to be open and available to everyone. Like that was their original intent. It was never designed to be authenticated. It was never
Mm-hmm.
designed to have sessions. All of those are things that we have bolted on after the fact as we identified needs for that. But the protocol itself didn't have security built into it in any meaningful way.
Yeah.
And so, long story short, here's what I'll say about WAFs, dude. They are easy to implement now because you're literally just changing a DNS record. They are super inexpensive and they are absolutely outstanding. So I actually just did an analysis for one of our clients on the different WAFs that were out there because they were worried about latency. And it's like 0.1 milliseconds.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like it's really not that big of a deal. And these new cloud-based WAFs can implement denial of service protection. Like they can absorb a very large scale DDoS. And so I just can't say enough good things about it, right? It's so inexpensive and easy to implement that there's no reason you shouldn't be doing it.
Yep.
So
Yeah, and to drive home a point about the patching things, like a lot of these applications drive core business functions, right? For banks, for
dude,
credit
yeah.
unions, for insurance companies, like it's their core business. And it's not
Yeah.
like they can just take it down one evening, or an afternoon or for a weekend, right? To patch it or to upgrade it. It's like they lose millions of dollars a minute, some of them, the big banks and the big insurance companies and things like that. So if you can't quote policies or if you can't write new business and stuff like that, that's a significant hit. So technologies like this are really, really important for maintaining the business.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you mentioned logging too, and that's a really important thing. It's incredibly challenging. And those of you out there that have ever been involved in the development process will understand this. It's incredibly challenging to correctly wrap authentication, authorization, and logging into a web application. Like the amount of code required to do those three things is probably more than the functional code behind the login. And with a WAF, man, you flip a switch, and now
Yep.
you have all of this telemetry. So yeah, I just can't say enough good things about it. There just really aren't a lot of drawbacks, and that's rare in our world, right?
Yep. Not to mention the value in instant response. If you're
Oh
investigating
yeah,
an
dude.
incident or you're trying to investigate suspicious activity in your network or something
Yeah.
like that, having that data of what is hitting everything externally can be really valuable.
Yeah, and imagine going to your dev team and being like, "Yo, guys, here's this list of 27 different features that I want to add that actually make us no money, and I want you to put them all in my application over the weekend."
Yeah.
Yeah, dude, they're gonna fight you in the parking lot.
Yep.
So like, flip the switch on a WAF.
Yep.
I mean,
Definitely.
it's outstanding. So um, all right. So real quick, admin for you guys that have made it this far into the podcast. First of all, I really appreciate you guys listening. We can't say enough great things about the audience. We've seen a tremendous amount of increases in listeners, and we just appreciate you guys. We couldn't do it without you.
Shout out to
And
Australia, by the way, for
shout
max
out to
listenership.
Australia. Yeah, that is wild, isn't it? Yeah, it's like I don't remember exactly what the percentages was, but it was like 80% of our listeners are either in the US or Australia.
Yeah.
And then the other 20% are like, all over the place. So we love you guys. We really appreciate you. And so if you don't mind, give us a quick review on whatever platform you're listening on. It shouldn't take more than about 30 seconds or maybe even less. And we really appreciate it. It helps us out a lot.
Cool. So DMZs, DMZ, demilitarized zones, seem to be a lost art. It's something that I think doesn't get enough airtime. Maybe because of zero trust and that taking over kind of like the conversation and that being the thing that everybody is wanting to go towards. Maybe it's because work from home. Since 2020 COVID era, like people are more distributed, so maybe there's less people see less value in DMZs. But I think DMZs, when done well, can be really beneficial. It doesn't necessarily have to be a DMZ, right? Like I think the spirit of a DMZ, I think, is what's important
I
here,
agree.
and that's segmentation, right?
Mhm.
Defined, hardened, securely segmented networks that distinctly separate your publicly facing stuff, the stuff that's going to get poked at and scanned and prodded on a regular basis every single day, from everything else that's more important, and especially important in a traditional on-prem environment where you have Active Directory and CA servers and all of your internal infrastructure. And then you have these Fortinet appliances and these Avanti things and remote access. Like that should be distinctly separate, hardened, secured, locked down. So anything on the internet, I think, you take from this is the sentiment of secure, hardened network segmentation. It's a lost art, and it can definitely go a long way to defending your organization.
Absolutely, dude. What's old is new again, right? And I agree with you. I'm not sure where we decided as a collective industry that WAFs and DMZs are no longer relevant. They absolutely are, and we actually see this in the web app pen testing world probably more so than anywhere else. In that we can compromise an application server that leads us to a database server that leads us into a corporate network. And I think cloud may have kind of changed our philosophy on that, because
Mhm.
people are like, well, it's in the cloud, so
Yep.
it's okay. Or it's already on the internet because it's in the internet, it's on the cloud, it's not on prem, so we're not going to treat it like we would a typical on-prem system. And I think that's a huge mistake,
Yep.
because like you said, the concepts of segmentation, man, are still very real and
Yep.
very relevant in our world. And so I'm not encouraging people to go out and just start creating large scale DMZs like we did in the banking world in like 2007. But, you still need to be protecting systems from other systems, especially systems that are publicly facing, right? That are facing the internet, because those things are basically to be assumed as compromised.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so, like, if you have a web app server that anybody can touch, I would assume that it has been compromised and treat it exactly that way, which means I'm not going to let it touch anything else. If it is touching a data layer, bro, I am going to limit how it does that in every way I possibly can. Only one port,
Mhm.
only one direction, like we're really going to get down into, like firewall rules
Yep.
on that, that traffic between the application layer. So anyway, yeah, I
Yep.
think it's totally relevant, dude.
Yeah, and code execution on a web server shouldn't mean that a threat actor now has full control of your corporate network or is on your corporate network. And
Absolutely.
I think the important takeaway from me is a couple things: reducing attack surface, right? Reducing what the attacker has access to if something were to be compromised, right? If that VPN device or that file transfer product or whatever it might be that's sitting on the internet that you're using, reducing the attack surface in the event that it is compromised and kind of thinking through that as if it were, right? Thinking through that from a threat modeling perspective, limiting the blast radius, so to speak, and kind of controlling what data or what networks a threat actor might have access to after the fact, after they have compromised that.
Yep. Yeah, no, absolutely, dude.
The other thing, kind of similar to this, is strong vulnerability intelligence, we'll call it, and quick patching response. So this is something that I kind of alluded to in the beginning of the episode when we talked about the data exfiltration. The time to data exfil is quickly going down. Used to be several days or several weeks, and now it's down to days and hours, right? So having good insight into what vulnerabilities are out there, what exploits are out there, what 0 days are being exploited, and things like that are really important. And having the ability to quickly patch things, having processes in place where you can quickly spin things up and down, patch things, remediate issues, kind of at a moment's notice. Because what we're seeing, and this is something that was also illustrated in the DBIR this year, is the vulnerabilities on the KEV that are being exploited, the time to exploitation is 5 days. Like the median time to exploitation of a vulnerability on the KEV is 5 days. So if there's a vulnerability on the KEV list and it's being exploited, the median time to exploitation, 5 days.
Wow. What's that list you're talking about?
That's the known exploited vulnerabilities list from CISA.
Cool.
So that is a list of vulnerabilities that have been known to be exploited.
Yep.
That's kind of the whole idea of that list. There's a lot of old vulnerabilities. There's a lot of new vulnerabilities. Obviously, like when a firewall product gets on that list, the time to exploit is very short. It's a very short window. And if you can't patch within 24 to 72 hours, a day to 5 days in that window, that's when bad things start to happen.
All right, so check this out. I'm gonna say something we've never talked about on the show before. So, somebody asked me a question. We were at Evolve, the legal security conference, a couple weeks ago, right? And somebody asked me a question that I thought was interesting. Is like, how do the bad guys know what we have, right?
Mhm.
Because obviously the rate at which exploits are being leveraged against technologies speaks to the fact that they're not just arbitrarily looking for people after an exploit comes out. So what do I mean by that? So if you go out and look at WordPress articles, right? Like I think Dark Reading does it. Like they do these articles where they're like, oh, the new super triple Y, WordPress plugin has been found to be vulnerable, and there's 500,000 instances of it out on the internet. Okay, we know that because there are companies who dedicate themselves to auditing technology on the public internet. So they're constantly scanners. They're scanning the internet, identifying what's out there. What does that mean to you guys who are trying to be defenders and defends against these really fast turnarounds? The bad guys know what you have. They have already inventoried your environment. They have already scanned your environment. They know you've got, let's say, solar winds, right? Or they know maybe Move It's a better one because solar winds doesn't tend to be on the public internet, right? Let's say you got Move It. There's a forum somewhere on the dark web that's got a list of all the companies that have Move It on the public internet, or at the very least, a list of IP addresses. So when a new vulnerability comes out, they for $20 in Bitcoin, they buy the list and they start spamming the POC that's probably released on GitHub against all these IP addresses. And you're on that list if you have that technology. So what that means is if you don't know what you have and you don't have a rapid turnaround for that, the bad guys know what you have, and their turnaround is going to be better than yours. And so, there is no obscurity when it comes to this kind of stuff. It's a known entity. And so, what I would recommend everyone do, right? If you are handling your own vulnerability scanning and patch management, go out to somewhere like Feedly or some of these other aggregate tools and be monitoring for your critical technologies that are on the public internet. Even if they're not on the public internet, dude, if it's a tier one asset, you should know what it is, and you should have a daily, if not twice daily, automated search looking for vulnerabilities associated with that. And then you should have a process in place by which you immediately go address that. If
Mhm.
you're not doing that and you're trying to just like let your normal patch cycle take hold, guys, we're talking weeks and months here,
Yep.
right? And so you have to have a separate process that is outside of your normal vulnerability management process, what we would call like critical asset vulnerability
Mhm.
management or something along that route. And so it's not enough to just be quick. You got to know about it
Yep.
and be able to address it, preferably inside of 24 hours.
Yeah, something I would do for vulnerability management clients would be we would, do the regular vulnerability management, Nessus, internal, external, all that.
Mm-hmm.
But then we'd also run a KV report, right? A KV report against their technology stack.
Yep.
So we'd look at their technology stack, we'd run a report and say which of these technologies and these products that we have are on the KV, which ones are new. We have to go address those first. Like those are the
Yep.
first ones we do. It doesn't matter what other critical vulnerabilities Nessus says we have. KV is first. And that would be my recommendation is write a PowerShell script or Python or something, feed it your tech stack and say, give me a list every single day of all the newly added KVs for Fortinet or for Chrome or for SonicWall or whatever you are concerned about, and feed that into your program and say, these are the ones I have to address first. Before everything else, these are the ones. That would be my recommendation.
Agreed.
For kind of tackling that tactically.
100% agree with that. My biggest takeaway for anybody listening is you can't just rely on your normal patch management process. You just can't.
Yep.
We're not in that world anymore. You have to be able to identify and address these very quickly.
Yeah, and the reason is because it doesn't matter how many critical, high, medium, lows you've remediated. If there's a vulnerability that gets released and there's a known exploit for it, and in 3 days you get breached, none of that mattered.
It takes one. It only takes one. Yep, completely agree with that. So yeah, very, very emotional and strong feelings associated with this conversation because it is so flippin' important, and it's also not that hard to address, right? I mean, we're not talking about spending 10 hours a week. We're talking about spending 30 minutes a week just reviewing these lists over the course of several days and making sure that your stuff's not on it.
Yep.
So anyway,
yeah, you definitely got to stay up to date, or you have to pay someone to be up to date for you.
Yeah.
Subscribe to Intel feeds or whatever you have to do to stay abreast of what's happening. In cybersecurity, it's probably one of the most important things I think for defenders is to stay up to date. It's important for us as offensive operators and kind of pen testers to stay up to date on what threat actors are doing, the TTPs that they're using, so that we can emulate those for our customers. Mm-hmm. But it's also important for defenders to stay abreast of what's going on in the threat landscape, what attackers are doing, what vulnerabilities are out there, what the trends are, kind of what they're after, what are their motivations. I think it's one of the most important jobs for a defender.
No question. No question.
So phishing. Phishing is, I don't know, phishing is kind of a tough one in my opinion, because it involves the human element. And to some extent, it's like, what can you do? You can lead a horse to water. You can't make them drink. You can only do so much to mitigate this. And I think my approach has kind of changed over the years. I started back when I worked at an insurance company. I started doing a lot of security awareness training and really focusing on the person and the human. And like, we got to teach them the red flags, and they got to know how to identify this stuff. They got to know how to find it. They got to not click on stuff. And it's like, they got to do their job. They're going to click on emails. They're going to download PDFs. I think today we have to build systems where that shouldn't matter, right? It shouldn't matter if Susie clicks on the link. It shouldn't matter if she downloads a PDF and runs something. To some extent, we have to design and build secure systems so that those things don't take us completely down, right? And that's what I think about in the context of phishing defense is modern email security. Like there's a probably a handful of lists of items, Brad, we could probably rattle off as like, if you have an email security product, it should probably have these features.
Yep.
So some of the ones that I think are important to me are around like the email domains. Something we say all the time is like newly registered domains. If you get an email with a link in it, right, and that link or a PDF or something links to a domain, even an email address, if that email or that domain is newly registered, right, within the last 30 days, 10 days, there's, can vary the registration there, but if it's newly registered, it's suspicious, in my opinion. It should be blocked. It should be or quarantined and kind of analyzed first before it gets passed on to the user. So that's something that I think is really key from a phishing defense standpoint.
I completely agree. And back to what you were talking about with the human element thing, I kind of look at it like victim blaming, right? And so if you've ever driven on a public highway, those are the people who are checking their email, right? The person running 10 below in the fast lane, the person who doesn't use blinkers, who pulls on a door that says push, right? It's just a matter of, human nature. And we make mistakes, man,
Yep.
and in this particular scenario, that mistake could be a lapse in judgment because they're talking to their, significant other on the phone. And then they're like, oh, the email came in, click, because they're not paying attention.
Yep.
You're right. We need to design the system around them. And what I would say, the reputation thing you were talking about, right? You absolutely need to have that. But what's more important than just buying a product or a solution that says, "Oh yeah, we do reputation"? Understand what that means, because that means different things to different organizations. And this is absolutely a scale of quality.
Mhm.
So, like I'll give you a great example. The Microsoft's M365 filters by default, absolute garbage. You have to have something else beyond that. And I'm not recommending you guys roll your own rules or anything, but what I am saying is you need to find a product that does a better job. So you need to front end that with something else,
Yep.
right? And this is unfortunately the world that you get what you pay for.
Mm-hmm.
Because if someone were to come to me, and I haven't really been in the email security field like intently for some time, but when I was in the financial world, we used Proofpoint, and
Yep.
it was amazing. In fact, everything that you're about to talk about are things that we really loved about it, but it's also ridiculously expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So not everybody's going to be able to buy that. There are other solutions out there, I'm
Yep.
sure, but I guess what we're trying to say here is make sure you evaluate and understand the capabilities of the product that you're using, because if it's not doing newly registered domains with a higher scrutiny from a reputation
Yep.
perspective, then you're wrong.
Yep.
So
There's a lot of cool products out there. One that I'll shout out that I think is really cool, Sublime. That's an email security product. They have a free tier. They're not paying me to say that. I just have I've tried it a little bit, and I think it's really cool.
okay,
You can use Yara rules in a lot of these products now, or Yara like rules to analyze the emails for suspicious activity. So you can take indicators like if it's the first time that email's ever communicated with the recipient, right? That is, a score on like a threat matrix, right? Like think of a score, right? And each kind of subsequent IOC kind of adds a little risk to it. So, a newly registered domain bumps it up a little bit. The first time the email account was ever communicated to that organization bumps it up a little bit. If there's attachments, if there's a zip file, if it's attempting to impersonate someone at the company, like all these things can kind of make the email rank a little bit higher in terms of suspiciousness, to the point where it gets blocked, quarantined, etc. The other important feature I think is really key for email security products is the ability to search and threat hunt your emails, and obviously remove or quarantine emails from an inbox. If there's ever a suspicious email in an email box, the most important thing is, or one of the most important things to me, is removing that so the user can't click it and so they can't forward it on. So if you have the ability to threat hunt, search all your emails and be like, oh yeah, these other ones, I knew about this one. There's these other ones that I didn't even catch, but meet they match the criteria that I'm looking for. I'm going to pull those out immediately so the user can't do something, with those emails.
Yep. And so the reason that is, and I'll kind of build on that a little bit, the reason that that's so important is, and we're going to talk about attachments and stuff like that, right? But a lot of the analysis that has to be done on these emails is done after the fact, right? So the email will come through, and most of these, email security gateways, as I think is the right term for that,
Mhm.
most of them will pass it on if it's not immediately flagged, and then continue the analysis. And so if it determines after it has passed that email on that that email is actually bad, it needs to have the capability to go rip those out of the inbox. It also
Yep.
needs to have the capability to know if they have been opened, and that will give you a head start.
Yep. So I know we're about 35 minutes into the podcast episode. So for those who are still listening, I appreciate it. Hopefully, what we're saying is continuing to be interesting or of value to you. I've got 2 more sections to talk about, so stay tuned. That's stolen credentials I want to talk about, and third-party / vendor management kind of defenses. So defenses for stolen creds, and vendor management or third parties. So number one takeaway for me from an exploitation standpoint is code repos. So
Yeah.
this is illustrated in a number of reports from DBIR to MTrends and others, is that code repositories like GitHub and GitLab,
Mm-hmm.
stolen secrets from those make up a large majority of the web compromise, right?
Yep.
Think about JWT tokens or JWT's API keys, SSH keys, things like that you might commonly see from software developers or in Subversion repositories, code tracking, and the continuous integration, continuous delivery platforms as well, and ticketing systems, right? Those are kind of the core things that I would audit for secrets and for credentials. There's a number of great products. I think Truffle Hog is one, but there's a number of products, commercial and free, that you can use that can automatically scan these. They can send you an alert. They can automatically kind of take action using GitHub Actions, and a lot of cool stuff. But if you have any kind of code, if your vendor has any kind of code development processes, which is probably a lot of organizations, those have to be audited. They should be audited on a regular basis, looking for those specific things, because we see that all the time. We see it in reports, and we see it in our pen tests that we steal an API key from a GitHub repo that wasn't locked down. We use it to access, the private authenticated API endpoints, and we're off to the races, compromising our organization.
Yep. So one of my favorite stories that I like to tell, and this isn't a unique story in our world, it's just an interesting one, right? Is we were doing an external pen test for, I don't even remember what market vertical they were in. It's not important, but we found some developers' LinkedIn profile, and developers love to put their GitHub repos in their LinkedIn profile because rightfully so. I understand. Well, we followed the trail, man. We went over to his GitHub repo and downloaded a whole bunch of stuff off of there, parsed through it, found a set of AWS keys, and we went from an external pen test to a cloud internal pen test real freaking quick on Monday morning. And so, this absolutely happens, and that's exactly how it happens. And in a lot of cases, they'll target you even if their intent was not to target you to begin with. They will find these keys because there are indexing services out there that look for things like open buckets and compromised AWS keys. I think Gray Hat Warfare is one of them that just indexes all this stuff. And you could just be a bad guy looking for a victim. You don't even have to be targeting anybody in particular. So yeah, man, it's a real thing. It is.
Yep. So when it comes to stolen credentials or defenses against stolen credentials, obviously MFA and 100% adherence or adoption, right? And that means no, the CEO can't get an exception. It has to be fully enforced. Anywhere that you care about should have MFA strongly and strictly enforced, and audited regularly to make sure that there's 100% adherence to that.
Yep. And if you don't know what strong MFA is, I think Sam and I did an MFA episode recently. So
Yep.
we have some episodes out there with regards to what is weak MFA. So yeah, keep going.
Password policies. This is something I see commonly on internal pen tests, but also on externals, right? As part of our external pen test process, we spray a number of passwords throughout the whole engagement. So the whole external pen test, we're spraying passwords at least once an hour to look for weak passwords or compromised credentials that we have kind of pulled off the dark web.
Yep.
And so the kind of takeaway is don't let users use, company name 2025 !
Right.
Or, the company's, their short name or their slang name, anything related to the company, And of course, any of the weak passwords like the season year and things like that should
Yeah.
technically not be allowed. You can use Microsoft Entra password protection. You can use Lithnet, AD password protection, or whatever else. But you should have technical controls that don't allow users to even create those passwords.
Yeah.
And then have policies for IT admins to say, hey, don't create weak passwords for users. Make sure they're unique when you create them, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know why, but here lately there's something that's been on my radar a lot with the folks that we've been working with, and that is reusing passwords between environments.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we've got clients that have like web apps that are using the same password to communicate with a SQL server that some other service is running with the same username and password. Guys, we're better than that, man.
Yep.
We can definitely do better than that, especially between environments, right? Like if we're talking about like a public network versus a private network, like we shouldn't be, reusing those creds. So anyway,
Yep.
Go ahead.
Yeah, especially local admin credentials we see often is like we have a corporate laptop that's like a end home user, right? The remote, but the local admin account was set up with a specific password, and then that password is also reused within the corporate environment, and there's no controls like labs to randomize them. That's super common to see as well. So last on protecting credentials is, and kind of access in general or authentication, is conditional access.
Yes.
So a lot of organizations now are hybrid. They have Microsoft 365 and Entra, and they still have a little bit of on-prem. And most of those are going to have conditional access. They're going to have Microsoft licensing that gives them access to those features. I think conditional access is a very strong defensive control. I posted something on Twitter the other day. I'll have to find a link for it. But essentially, Meryl from Microsoft chimed in on it and said, hey, here's a website you can go to. And it's kind of like 1 through 5 step-by-step process for enabling like the 14 most common conditional access policies that you can use to help protect against compromise. Mm-hmm. And he shared that. It's a great link, and it just walks you through all the conditional access policies you need. But a couple that I wanted to call out were blocking legacy authentication, geofencing, and requiring compliant devices. There's also token protection. That's relatively new that helps protect against those session theft, the session hijacking attacks, like what Tyler and I talked about last week. So conditional access can be very strong. There's like 8 to 12 to 15 policies that you need. Like there's not a lot. If you have more than that, you should probably review them and figure out which ones have a lot of overlap. Mm-hmm. But just a handful of them, and you can block a really quite a bit of stuff from quite a bit of account compromise type of attacks.
Yep, absolutely. And all of this is a layered approach, right? No one thing that we're trying to tell you guys to implement is going to be the magic, right? But yeah, absolutely, dude. The conditional access is huge. Just had a conversation about that this week.
Yep.
It's like, and it doesn't have to be just Microsoft's conditional access in M365. There are open source tools out there that will allow you to geofence. Like with the installation of a very small binary. And so if you do have services exposed, like we run into people that have to have like SMTP, POP3, older style protocols, man. Okay, cool. If you got to have them, fine. Let's wrap some protections around them. And that's exactly what you're talking about here.
Yep. And the last section before we get too long and wrap up is third-party vendor management defenses. Mm-hmm. So I kind of categorize these into 2 buckets. One is like your data hosting processing providers. So who's hosting your website, or if you have, infrastructure as a service, right? Or if you have a co-location, you're using a co-location or a data center, right? For certain things, like maybe your DR site is at a colo, right? Mm-hmm. Couple things you want to know is how secure, resilient their systems are. So you need to audit them. You have to have processes in place, ideally before you onboard that vendor, right, to go through and kind of do an assessment of how good they are handling their environment and how well they're defining their security systems. Mm-hmm. And with that comes SLAs, specifically SLAs around patching, patching vulnerabilities and remediating findings from pen tests and other security assessments. Mm-hmm. There's been a number of times where we've had conversations with clients as a result of pen tests, and they're like, well, we found this vulnerability in some third-party product, and you're like, they go to the vendor, and the vendor, either pushes back, or they're not quite sure, or they take a long time to patch it. And the client really, without that contractual language, they don't have much to hold them to. Right. So
Right.
it's important to have that language to say, hey, you guys said you were going to patch this in 30 days. Like, it's been 90 days. This still isn't fixed, whatever. So I think having that is really important when it comes to your vendors.
Yeah, and you got to have teeth in that contract, dude. Just saying like you need to have this done, within 30 days or whatever. It's you have to have this done in 30 days, or you are going to forego payment from us
Mhm.
until you have it resolved. Like, it has to
Yep.
have a punitive impact on them for not meeting those SLAs. And
Yep.
I understand that that creates a difficult environment to do business, but you got to protect yourself, man.
Yep. Yep. And there's a lot more we can talk about in this subject. I think we can kind of like wrap it up there.
Yeah.
The
I think
last
we
thing I'll
should
say,
do a whole episode on vendor management, honestly. Like,
yeah, I mean, each one
seriously,
of
I think
these
we should.
subjects, right? We've
Yeah.
probably done, I don't know if we've done a specific vendor management, but we've done episodes on credentials, we've done episodes on phishing, and, a lot of the stuff we've done independent episodes on. But I think the point I wanted to make is, there's no silver bullets. There's no one thing that's going to prevent all breaches. As foundational as this stuff is, it's not simple. A lot of this
Yep.
stuff is difficult. You have to work with people. It takes a while. It's expensive. So stay vigilant, stay dedicated to the process.
That's right.
And most importantly, focus on the critical areas, the issues that are most likely to be abused or attacked by threat actors first. And I have in my notes, don't only listen to the people that you hear on podcasts and reading reports. As smart as we are,
Right.
um, we don't know your environment specifically, so you have to make sure that you're applying these techniques or these methods, this kind of information to your organization and to your firms as needed.
Yep. I completely agree with all of that, man. And yeah, big topic. I'm surprised we got it in as short as we did, even though it's a long episode. It was still we covered a lot of ground, so I really
Yep.
really enjoyed it. So, all right, folks, that's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening or watching. And if you enjoyed this, please share it with your colleagues and your friends and your network. And check us out over at offsec.blog or secureit360.com. We'll see you next Friday.